En dan de boekenweek. Vanavond boekenbal en morgen begint officieel de boekenweek. En het boekenweekgeschenk is Woede, oftewel Fury, van Salman Rushdie. Die was gisteren in de Lutherse kerk en werd daar geïnterviewd. Georganiseerd door het CPNB. En ondanks alle lof in de kranten was de interviewer die men had uitgekozen, Henk van Woerden, eigenlijk niet bestand tegen de auteur en ook wel een beetje showman Salman Rushdie. Er werd gezegd, we zochten een interviewer die native English speaker was. Ja, maar dat deed hij dan wel binnensmonds. Dus wat dat betreft een vrij zwakke en qua keus te bekritiseren interviewer in gesprek met Salman Rushdie.
Mr. Rushdie, welcome to the table. Welcome to Amsterdam.
Thank you.
I have spent, it must be close to 2 weeks now, immersed in your books, marooned with them, in fact.
Well, I hope it wasn't too horrible.
It was a very enjoyable and a perplexing experience as well. Your entire body of work. Somebody said the other day to me, Salman Rushdie is the James Joyce of our day, and indeed these huge tapestries, which they are, the many strands, the all-encompassing, compelling, epic and perplexing ambition which you had, must have set off somewhere. And while reading in these past 2 weeks, I wondered, there's one, I think in one of your essays you describe the boy Salman Rushdie, he must have been about 12 or 13 years old, in a room in Bombay with a view on the sea. Mm-hmm. I wondered, did the 13 or 12-year-old Salman Rushdie, could he have imagined that he would once be in rivalry with the great devotional books of world literature?
Well, you know, I always wanted to be, my parents tell me that little boy in that room would always say that he wanted to be a writer. I don't remember this myself. But they said that when people would say, what do you want to do when you grow up? Instead of saying, I want to be a fireman or an astronaut, I would always say that I wanted to be a writer. And I have no memory of it. And it's quite clear to me that I wouldn't have known what it meant. You know, because you could be many things at the age of 12 or 13, but what you can't be is somebody who knows what it is to be a writer. What you can be is somebody who knows what it is to be a reader. You know, and I think that's what I meant, really. I think I loved inhabiting the worlds of books and wanted to be a part of that thing, you know, that thing that happens inside the pages, inside the covers of books. And it went on being the case. I never had another plan, you know. I mean, the only other, well, actually I did. I wanted to be an actor for a while. In fact, I have to say I've just made my debut in a feature film.
So that dream has come true as well.
Yeah, well, I'm playing a very difficult part of a writer called Salman Rushdie. It's a very, very small part in a film called Bridget Jones's Diary. And so there we are. So
but those two ambitions were present.
I did think about being an actor, but really this was the only thing I've ever seriously thought about wanting to do.
Your books, I describe them as epic, and they're extremely large canvases. Painting never came into the issue.
I wish I could paint. I mean, I must say...
You've tried, haven't you?
I mean, I can draw somewhat, but I've never had any lessons. And I remember when I first met Günter Grass many years ago. He was living at the time in a small village outside Hamburg called Wewelsvliet, in which he had two houses, in one of which he sort of lived and wrote, and the other one was a sculpture studio, where he would go at the end of his working day and make these wonderful bronzes and terracottas and so on. And they were all around the same subjects as his books, you know, so they were bronzes and terracottas of flounders and little boys with tin drums and rats and eels and, you know, things like that. And I thought what a wonderful gift it must be to be able to come out of one creative process and switch into a completely other creative process. And I envied him that. But no, I can't paint.
Would you be capable of directing a movie? I mean, your books are very filmic.
I think everybody in this room thinks they're capable of directing a movie, you know. And I think it's
Really? Why?
No, this is our kind of, you know, generational obsession. We all want to be film directors. I don't really, you know. I mean, I think I have enough friends who direct movies to know that what happens is that you sit in a room and people come in at incredible speed and ask you for decisions. You know, red furniture, green furniture.
The East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet, and then they do meet in one person. And, you know, referring to Kipling and the whole thing, and you've written essays on Kipling, which I find very interesting as well, but particularly on the early work. Kipling launched the idea of the white man's burden with the empire striking back, if you know what I mean. The silly way of describing it, but it is a way of describing what's happening to modern literature in the English world. With the empire hitting back, is there such a thing as a black man's burden?
But you could say the black man's burden is the white man, but that's probably it's probably too easy to say that.
If one looks at a group of writers from the third world, let's call it that, are they obliged by the very fact of their migration to write about a certain issue? Not at all.
I mean, I think, you know, you can't prescribe writing, you know, because writing has a great deal to do with the temperament. You know, it has there are people who are by instinct public and wish to engage in public issues as a part of their work, and there are people whose instinct is quite otherwise, you know, and it would be wrong to say that a certain kind of writing is not legitimate because it doesn't deal with public issues, you know, and that would be a very prescriptive way of approaching it. I mean, because I suppose my training was as a historian, because that's what I did at university, not literature. I mean, I've always been very interested in the way in which history impacts on human beings, you know, and that's shaped a great deal of what I've written.
Yes.
But I mean, I've always wished I could write a Jane Austen novel. You know, I just can't do it. I mean, it doesn't mean that I don't think she's any good. You know, and if there was, and there are Indian writers, for instance.
And with Jane Austen, you mean somebody being totally unaware of the French Revolution at the time?
Yeah, I mean somebody who could write an entire career without mentioning the historical events of the period. You know, so, and the only soldiers who ever show up are, you know, handsome young men at parties. But by which I don't mean to belittle her, you know, because I think what she does by making this tiny microcosm of the universe is to discover everything within it. You know what I mean? And I admire it. It's just that I can't do it. I think somebody once said, may even have been me, that it seems to me I've only ever thought of two good ways of writing. One is to try and put almost as much as you can in, you know, and the other is to leave almost everything out. And those both work, but it seems to be nothing in the middle works. You know, that you could either, like, to use the Jane Austen example, take this tiny, you know, strand of human experience and try to create the rest of human experience from it, or you can try and shovel everything in. You know, and I've on the whole been of the shovel everything in school. You know, and
does this mean you can't conceive of writing, say, it's not particularly the length of a book, but conceive of writing a talked book in which
I'm getting simpler.
Down.
You know, this book's quite simple, and it's also half the length of the one before. You know, so I'm finally, you know, I'm finally getting the hang of it.
Just getting onto this book, actually, but here it is, everybody. Salman Rushdie. It almost seems as if has Fury become your middle name?
But it is in Dutch. No, I mean Fury. The sense in which Fury is used in the book is not only to mean anger. You know, it's used in both the creative and destructive senses of the word, and that's to say, there's creative fury, there's grand passion, you know, etc. And the way in which the title resonates through the book is in all those different senses of it. So it's really I hope a book about the passions, really, and about what they can unleash in human beings and in human society, which is both, you know, for good and ill.
It's also a book about a man who longs for the absence of history, which seems peculiar to me. Malik Solanka, the main figure of the book, moves to America, and he wishes to sever himself from everything he's left behind. He prefers to. He'd like to erase himself. He puts it that way in the book.
Yeah, it doesn't work though.
No, it doesn't work. But the very intention that he has is in complete contradiction with, say, Satanic Verses, in which you portray the Islamic world as wanting to destroy history and destroy clocks. Now you have a main figure, Malik Solanka, wanting to do virtually the same thing, move into the States and forget about his past, the man without history.
Well, I mean, I've written so much about people, bogged down in history, people who can't exist outside the context of history, that I just wanted to write about somebody who wanted to escape all that. It's I would have thought a natural progression almost, although I didn't think of it in quite that schematic way. I just wanted to write a novel about somebody who wants to step out of his life, which is, I think, a desire that many people have at one time or another. They just want to shed the skin, and be someone else somewhere else. And he actually puts that into practice and then discovers it doesn't do him any good.
Well, there are two sides to that. I mean, are you tired of roots? Are you tired of your own roots?
Well, I mean, roots, I've always, but I think a long time ago, I think in Shane, somewhere in that it says that roots are a conservative fiction, because they're things that suggest that you have to be tied down. Mm-hmm. Look under your feet, no roots. We're not plants. If you have legs, they walk.
True.
So I just think that the idea of roots has always been to me a side issue. And I think, in a way, that I come from too many places, and that's always been. I've always thought of that as a good thing, as an advantage to me as a person and as a writer.
Right. There was a strange little report in a Dutch newspaper the other day by a writer called Anil Ramdas, who's with a Hindu background, came from Suriname and has now moved to India as correspondent of one of our quality newspapers. And the thing was titled, "I Don't Like Roots," which, of course, in Dutch is a bit of a joke, because the same word for roots is the same word as a carrot, as if he was commenting on his diet.
Well, I like carrots.
If I must assume that some of your figures are autobiographical, then you probably disliked Kippers.
Oh, the Kipper story is completely truthful. This is true. It was just for people who haven't read the Satanic Verses, there's a moment in which describes...
Chandra takes 90 minutes to...
Yeah, this boy who's just gone to English boarding school comes down to breakfast, and there's this curious fish on his plate, which he's never seen, and as he starts eating it, he gets this mouthful of bones, and nobody's ever taught him how to eat it, but of course they all sit there and don't teach him. And it takes him an hour and a half to have breakfast. And he says it's the first lesson of his life that England is this curious fish full of bones and nobody will ever teach you how to eat it. And that's completely autobiographical. I ate that fish. And I have to say I've never eaten a kipper since.
Are there other foodstuffs you sort of avoid?
No, just kippers.
Getting back to Sri Lanka, wanting to move, perhaps you, I must assume that the largest part of the audience hasn't read the book. Perhaps you'd like to read the first few pages as to...
Well, shall I do that? It's theoretically the publication day of the book, since it's first published here. So I thought one may as well on publication day read the beginning of the book. Right, I'll just read you a couple of pages of it. It begins in New York, and it's, as you'll see, it's an attempt to capture New York at a very particular moment, which is kind of yesterday, really. Professor Malik Solanka, retired historian of ideas, irascible doll maker, and since his recent 55th birthday, celibate and solitary by his own much criticized choice, in his silvered years found himself living in a golden age. Outside his window, a long, humid summer, the first hot season of the third millennium, baked and perspired. The city boiled with money. Rents and property values had never been higher, and in the garment industry it was widely held that fashion had never been so fashionable. New restaurants opened every hour. Stores, dealerships, galleries struggled to satisfy the skyrocketing demand for ever more recherche produce. Limited edition olive oils, $300 corkscrews, customized Humvees, the latest antivirus software, escort services featuring contortionists and twins, video installations, outsider art, feather-like shawls made from the chin fluff of extinct mountain goats. So many people were doing up their apartments that supplies of high-grade fixtures and fittings were at a premium. There were waiting lists for baths, doorknobs, imported hardwoods, antiqued fireplaces, bidets, marble slabs. In spite of the recent falls in the Nasdaq index and the value of Amazon stock, the new technology had the city by the ears. The talk was still of startups, IPOs, interactivity, the unimaginable future that had just begun to begin. The future was a casino, and everyone was gambling, and everyone expected to win. On Professor Solanka's street, well-heeled white youths lounged in baggy garments on roseate stoops, stylishly simulating indigence while they waited for the billionairedom that would surely be along sometime soon. There was a tall, green-eyed young woman with steeply slanting Central European cheekbones who particularly caught his sexually abstinent but still roving eye. Her spiky strawberry blonde hair stuck out clown fashion from under a black D'Angelo voodoo baseball cap. Her lips were full and sardonic, and she giggled rudely behind a perfunctory palm as old-world, dandyish, cane-twirling little Solly Solanka in straw Panama hat and cream linen suit went by on his afternoon walk. Solly, the college identity he'd never cared for but had not entirely managed to lose. "Hey, sir, excuse me." The blonde was calling out to him in imperious tones that insisted on a reply. Her satraps became watchful like a Praetorian guard. She was breaking a rule of big city life, breaking it brazenly, sure of her power, confident of her turf and posse, fearing nothing. This was just pretty girl chutzpah, no big deal. Professor Solanka paused and turned to face the lounging goddess of the threshold, who proceeded unnervingly to interview him. "You walk a lot, sir. I mean, 5 or 6 times a day I see you walking someplace. I'm sitting here, I see you come, I see you go, but there's no dog, and it's not like you come back with lady friends or produce. Also, the hours are strange. It can't be that you're going to a job, so I'm asking myself, why is he always out, walking, alone? There's a guy with a lump of concrete hitting women on the head across town. Maybe you heard that. But if I thought you were a weirdo, I wouldn't be talking to you. And you have a British accent, which makes you interesting too, right? A few times there, we even followed you, but you weren't going anywhere, just wandering, just covering ground. I got the impression you were looking for something, and it crossed my mind to ask you what that might be. Just being friendly, sir, just being neighborly. You're kind of a mystery. To me, you are, anyhow." Sudden anger rose in him. "What I'm looking for," he barked, is to be left in peace." His voice trembled with a rage far bigger than her intrusion merited. The rage which shocked him whenever it coursed through his nervous system like a flood. Hearing his vehemence, the young woman recoiled, retreating into silence. "Man," said the largest, most protective of the Praetorian Guard, her lover, no doubt, and her peroxide blonde centurion, "for an apostle of peace, you sure are filled up with war." She reminded him of someone, but he couldn't remember whom, and the little failure of memory, the senior moment, nagged at him infuriatingly. Luckily, she wasn't there anymore, no one was, when he returned from the Caribbean carnival, damp-hatted and soaked through after being caught unprepared by a squall of hard, hot rain. Passing the congregation Shearet Israel on Central Park West, a white whale of a building with a triangular pediment supported by 4 massive Corinthian columns, Professor Solanka, scurrying through the downpour, remembered the newly bat mitzvahed 13-year-old girl he'd glimpsed through the side door, waiting knife in hand for the ceremony of the blessing of the bread. "No religion offers a ceremony of the counting of the blessings," mused Professor Solanka. "You'd think the Anglicans at least would have come up with one of those." The girl's face glowed through the gathered gloom, its young, round features utterly confident of achieving the highest expectations. Yes, a blessed time, if you cared to use words like blessed, which Solanka, a skeptic, did not. On nearby Broadway and Amsterdam Avenue, there was a summer block party, a street market, doing good business in spite of the showers. Professor Solanka surmised that in the greater part of the planet, the goods piled high on these cut-price barrows would have filled the shelves and display cabinets of the most exclusive little boutiques and upper echelon department stores. In all of India, China, Africa, and much of the Southern American continent, those who had the leisure and wallet for fashion, or more simply in the poorer latitudes for the mere acquisition of things, would have killed for the street merchandise of Manhattan, as also for the cast-off clothing and soft furnishings to be found in the opulent thrift stores, the reject china and designer label bargains to be found in downtown discount emporia. America insulted the rest of the planet, thought Malik Solanka in his old-fashioned way, by treating such bounty with the shoulder-shrugging casualness of the inequitably wealthy. But New York in this time of plenty had become the object and goal of the world's concupiscence and lust, and the insult only made the rest of the planet more desirous than ever. On Central Park West, the horse-drawn carriages moved up and down. The jingling of the bells on their harnesses sounded like cash in hand. The season's hit movie portrayed the decadence of Caesar Joaquin Phoenix's imperial Rome, in which honor and dignity, not to mention life and death actions and distractions, were to be found only in the computer-regenerated illusion of the great gladiatorial arena, the Flavian amphitheater or Colosseum. In New York, too, there were circuses as well as bread. A musical about lovable lions, a bike race on Fifth, Springsteen at the Garden with a song about the 41 police gunshots that killed innocent Amadou Diallo, the police union's consequent threat to boycott the boss's concert, Hillary versus Rudy, the Cardinal's funeral, a movie about lovable dinosaurs, the motorcades of two largely interchangeable and certainly unlovable presidential candidates, Gush, Bohr, Hillary versus Rick, the lightning storms that hit the Springsteen concert in Shea Stadium, a Cardinal's inauguration, a cartoon about lovable British chickens, and even a literary festival. Plus a series of exuberant parades celebrating the city's many ethnic, national, and sexual subcultures, and ending sometimes in knifings and assaults on usually women. Professor Solanka, who thought of himself as egalitarian by nature and a born and bred metropolitan of the countryside is for cows persuasion, on parade days strolled sweatily cheek by jowl among his fellow citizens. One Sunday he rubbed shoulders with slim-hipped gay pride prancers. The next weekend he got jiggy beside a big-assed Puerto Rican girl wearing her national flag as a bra. He didn't feel intruded upon amid these multitudes. To the contrary, there was a satisfying anonymity in the crowds, an absence of intrusion. Nobody here was interested in his mysteries. Everyone was here to lose themselves. Such was the unarticulated magic of the masses, and these days losing himself was just about Professor Solanka's only purpose in life. When he got home from the parade, however, he was seized by melancholy, his usual secret sadness, which he sublimated into the public sphere. Something was amiss with the world. The optimistic peace and love philosophy of his youth having given him up, he no longer knew how to reconcile himself to an increasingly phony reality. Questions of power preyed on his mind. While the overheated citizenry was eating these many varieties of lotus, who knew what the city's rulers were getting away with? Not the Giulianis and Safirs who responded so contemptibly to the complaints of the abused women. Not these crude glove puppets, but the high ones who were always there, forever feeding their insatiable desires, seeking out newness, devouring beauty, and always, always wanting more. The never encountered but ever-present kings of the world. Godless Malik Solanka avoided crediting these human phantoms with the gift of omnipresence. The petulant, lethal Caesars, as his friend Reinhardt would say, the Bolingbroke's cold of soul. Professor Solanka shuddered faintly at this last image. Puppet masters were making us all jump and bray, Malik Solanka fretted, while we marionettes dance, who is yanking our strings? Well, that's sort of how it starts. That is how it starts.
The puppeteer plays an important role in there. You describe New York as a surrealist city. In fact, you've said elsewhere the modern city is the locus classicus of incompatible realities. Is this the only way to describe New York? Is the only way that you feel that you can describe a city of this kind?
Well, you know, the odd thing about New York is that, yes, it's full of incompatible realities, but people don't kill each other as much as they used to. I mean, that's to say, there's a kind of peace treaty between versions of the world that really can't coexist. You know, it's a very odd thing about the great metropolis that I think that happens in most great cities. that you have. I mean, that line actually, I think it's from the Satanic Princes, isn't it? It's
yes.
You sit in the bus next to somebody whose worldview has nothing to do with your own. That's it. These incompatible realities collide with each other, on the sidewalk.
Yeah, I know you don't like the term, but I mean, magic realism, is it forced onto you by... you go jumping. I'm sorry I mentioned that. Well, is it forced? I mean, elsewhere you say that, for instance, Marquez drags along the magic of the village to describe the town. Whereas in this case, the way that you describe New York, and in previous cases also the way you describe Bombay, obviously, and London, it almost seems that the metropolis forces one into something akin to surrealism, which is the case.
Well, I just think it's not a question of... I think it's just a question of noticing the surrealism that's there. I don't think... none of that's made up, I mean, that's what a city's like.
Yes, but you draw particular attention to this.
Well, I think the thing about... You see, the reason I twitch about magic realism is because it seemed to me to be what it really... You're right in saying there's really no difference between that and surrealism, what in the United States was called fabulism. I mean, it's simply a decision not to be limited by the constraints of naturalistic fiction. If the story requires something else.
You feel naturalistic fiction to be a constraint, in fact. You think it's inadequate for a person in your position, or generally attempting to...
This looks pretty naturalistic. I mean, up to a point, Lord Copper, but it's probably less fantasticated than some of them.
That's true, but I was trying to make the point that the fantasticated aspect is something that you need in order to be able to describe the world as it is now. Well, I think naturalism is no longer sufficient.
Well, I think in the kind of heyday of naturalism, the great realist novels of the 19th century, one of the things that those authors could bank on was that they and their readers would have an agreed description of the world. That their readers would have a picture of the world in common, and that the books would be written inside that picture. Well, that's just no longer the case. That picture got broken, and we no longer have versions of the world that we could all agree on, and sometimes those disagreements will be very radical. And sometimes they'll be comic and so on. But when you and your readers can no longer expect to have the same picture of reality, it changes how you write. It has to, because you can't make certain assumptions that 19th century realists could make.
Right, but what would you be? I mean, if you look towards the future, writing in the third millennium, as if we, could look at writing in the second millennium in one broad scope, one can't. But looking forward, but do you think that? I mean, I dislike the term myself, but that this kind of meta-realistic way, let's say, of describing the world is the future?
I don't know, it's kind of really very unfashionable suddenly. I mean, I've noticed, certainly in the English-speaking world, a great backlash against it. Let's say people don't want fantasy anymore, they want kitchen sink realism all over again. And,
but then I presume those are writers who haven't migrated, let's put it that way. Not migrated.
More or less, mostly, yes. But what I'm saying is the kind of critical orthodoxy has had a great swing, I mean, if I look at I'm just talking now about English and American literature, but if I talk about English language literature at the time that I began to write, there was, it seemed, a kind of real hunger for new versions of reality at that time, and I think a lot of writers of my sort of age benefited from that.
Yeah.
People were actually looking for new stuff, new kinds of stuff, new ways of saying things. And I think, I think if Midnight's Children, for instance, had come out 10 years earlier, it might have had a much more negative reception. But it came out at a time when people seemed to want things like that, And now I feel that once again, it's in not in but in little c conservative. I think it's quite a conservative literary moment, That'll change again, so I think the problem with projecting the future of literature is that it doesn't go in a straight line. It goes in swings back and forth.
Yeah, right. There's another thing you predict, I think, in this book too. You admit somewhere that that one cannot talk or write about tragedy in modern times because our times are imitative.
No, I didn't quite say that. What I said is that what quite often happens is...
Well, we echo tragedy.
Is tragedy played out by clowns. You know, I mean, I had this sense, this was a thought I had when I was writing Shame, really, and I was thinking about this, that at if I look at the political incident which gave rise to the novel, which was the conflict between General Zia-ul-Haq and Prime Minister Bhutto, you know, the idea that Bhutto put in power the man who became his nemesis and executioner.
Yes.
There's a kind of, I mean, you can imagine that Shakespeare could have done something with that. You know, there's a kind of real tragic sense there. But then I looked at these people, and they were really kind of very inadequate figures. You know, and I suddenly had this image of, you know, King Lear being played by people with red noses and shoes that were too big for them. You know, and fright wigs and falling over themselves all the time. And I felt this is what it's like. This is what modern history is like. It's the subject matter.
It's more farcical.
The subject matter is black tragedy. You know, I mean, terrible things are happening, but it's being played out by clowns. And that was a great liberation for me as a way of thinking about it. And I've ever since then thought of it that way. Public life, you know, tragic in content, farcical in manner.
It's the farcical side of things, though, that you seem to emphasize. Let's say the apotheosis in this book. There's a particular moment when the three furies, in fact, he sees the three furies in front of him, a bedroom scene at the dead of night, and you remark on it lately. It was the slightly tragic but mostly farcical event.
Well, it's actually, I don't want to give away because it is a key moment in the story. There's a moment in the story where you think it's going to become incredibly horrible. And you think, oh, here comes the nasty bit. And then instead of that, it becomes very funny. That's to say, there's a scene which is set up absolutely as a moment of kind of Anthony Hopkins violence.
Right, yeah.
You know?
you do it the other way around as well, where in farcical and comical scenes suddenly end with a note of extreme tragedy.
Yeah, well, I think, you see, that's, I mean, yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that's something I've always been very interested in. I've been interested in very fast changes of mood. You know, there's a wonderful collection of short stories by the American novelist, American short story writer Grace Paley, which one of the most wonderful things is its title. It's called Enormous Changes at the Last Minute. And I've always thought that this was something to aspire to, you know, to write a sentence which can begin in tragedy and end in farce, or the other way around, you know, to keep the reader's expectations sliding, you know, so that you don't know whether you start the sentence crying and you end up laughing, or the other way around, you know, and I think that's something I've tried really quite hard to develop, and occasionally has been misunderstood.
Expand. You feel misunderstood.
No, I won't expand.
Why not? Why not for the occasion?
That particular misunderstanding has been discussed too much already, I think. What I mean is that comedy is what gets you into trouble. In the end, it's not tragedy. Being funny is what people don't like. Because it's not reverential, you know, comedy is not reverential. And there's something, I think, intrinsically at the heart of the novel form, which is irreverent and comic. Look, the thing is, if you're a child and you're told stories, one of the first things you know about these stories is that they're not true. So it's our bottom line expectation of stories that they describe things that are not so. And then we grow up and we fool ourselves that the thing we find in books is so, you know. But actually, we're being told things that are not so. And by being told things that are not so, we learn about things that are so. That's the transaction of fiction, you know. That's an essentially comic transaction. I'm lying to you to tell you the truth, you know. The journalists pretend to be telling you the truth in order to lie to you. And novelists do the opposite. See, this is the difference between the forms. This is why novels last and newspapers don't. But if you can't see that A, that's what a novel is doing, and B, that that's essentially an absurd thing to try and do, but it's an absurdity that works because that's the thing that we agree, writers and readers, we agree to accept that contract. You know, if you don't accept the contract, then you can't understand what the text says. You just simply can't, because you know, you don't accept the terms, and that's the kind of misunderstanding I was talking about.
Right.
I do think it had to do with a category mistake. I think it had to do with not understanding the nature of the words on the page.
Getting back to Solanke, he's a man very much, and this again is a quote from one of your previous books, puts down his roots in the women he loves.
Yeah.
What, for instance?
What's your point?
Well, the point is that the various women in this book, the ones he leaves behind, the girl he meets on the streets in the extract you've just read to us, Myla, what does Myla, you know, mean to him? What does she become?
Well, she's by far the weirdest character of the book, and scared me when I was writing her, because there's a whole, you know, really quite perverse erotic element involving her, which
the reader's not aware of until they're about, you know, two-thirds of the way through.
Well, exactly. It sort of builds up and then gets very spooky, and spooked me. I have to say, well, you know, there are moments as a writer when you think, where is this coming from? You know, and is this all right? Like, not really all right, is it? Then you think, oh well, but this is what seems to be happening.
And you hadn't written towards that point.
No, well, I mean, you know, this book, I have to say, the experience of writing this book is quite unlike anything I can remember, except, well, the only experience comparable to it was when I was writing the second draft. I'll go back to the beginning. Midnight's Children, when I was writing it, the first draft was not written as a first-person narration. It was written as a third-person narration. It was rather longer than the book, even longer than the immense book that came out. And it was a mess. I mean, dreadful, because there was no organizing spirit. And in order to try and fix that, I tried to write the second draft as a first-person narration. You know, and I remember, you know, very, very vividly beginning to write the book in Salim's narration. And I've always thought of it as the moment I became a writer. Because this thing showed up on the page. This voice of kind of what seemed to me great strength and energy. And what's more, great determination. And it became very clear to me very fast that he was going to tell this story, and I just had to hang on for the ride, you know. And
that happened to you with Fury.
And he just took off, you know, and I followed him. And while he was telling his story, I learned how to write. You know, really, that's how I felt it. And it hasn't happened to me since until this. And I really felt this book just came out of me. You know, I mean, it alarmed me sometimes, the speed and the.
Were you grateful for the deadline? I mean, that must have helped.
You know, I have a view of deadlines, which is the hell with them. That's my view. I'm sorry about the people who need to produce books and so on. But my view is, as they say, do you want it good or do you want it Tuesday? I think, you know.
Does that mean you weren't under any pressure as far as the book?
No, the pressure was inside, not outside.
Right,
I mean, I was aware that actually I beat the deadline by some distance. I first extended it, then beat it. That's the thing to do. Always get yourself too much time. Then there's no deadline. See? So you lie to publishers and say you need much more time, and they swallow it, of course, and then you beat it by a month, and they're very grateful. So this is just a tip by publishers sitting at the front.
I'll keep that in mind.
No, but I mean, truthfully, this book came out of me like an express train, and it was the most bewildering, exciting, disturbing thing I've written for years as a result. You know, and it was as if I would have an idea, and I would then go back to read the bit I'd already written, and it was as if the idea was already prefigured there, even though I hadn't had it. You know, and then of course it wasn't always like that. I had to go back and fix things in order to make sense of. Yeah, of course. You know, I mean, I'm not claiming revelation here. You know, but it was for me a very weird writing experience, and things came out which I had fully not expected. I mean, for instance, the way in which the character of Mila developed. I had not anticipated at the beginning of the book, but seemed to be so appropriate when it showed up, that actually I went back and wrote stuff and made her more like it, so.
I felt sorry when, after about 2/3 of the book, she actually vanished from it. I felt it could have been expanded on. Do you think this is silly? Well, say as a painter, every particular painting has this particular size, and I actually felt this book to be, it could have been expanded, and it could have been longer.
Well,
I would have preferred it to be longer.
Well, every time I write a long book, people say they prefer it to be shorter.
I'm not complaining.
So I guess it makes a change,
But are you surprised if I say this?
Well, when I finished The Ground Beneath Her Feet, which is more than twice as long as this book, and took me almost 4 years, on the day that I finished it, sitting at my desk, I said to myself, shorter books more often. And this is my promise to myself, and I have said to everybody I know that if I ever get over 300 pages, hit me. I'm not going to write long books for a while. I'm going to write and I actually think the compression in this book is, gives it an energy which I like. I agree that you could unpack this material and make it 150 pages longer, and I don't think it would be better for it. Mila is there when she needs to be there, and then there's 3 women in the book, and they come and go, and they're there as much as they need to be, and I think it's good not to know everything about a character, it's good. I mean, Dickens used to tell you in the last chapter what happened to everybody in the life after the book. He'd even tell you what happened to the dog, Well, I don't want to know that, I don't know what happens to my characters when they leave the page. I don't know what happens to Mila in the next 25 years of her life. It could be that 25 years from now I'll find out, but I don't expect to. The point is the characters do what they're there to do, and then that's it, and I think this book has a kind of compressed force, which is, for me, the most exciting thing about having written it. That's what it felt like writing it. And I hope it feels like that reading it. I mean, so far, a lot of people have said to me that it's kind of grabbed them and they've sat there and read it in a single session, which is, of course, one of the things you can do with a book that's 250 pages long, and you can't do with a book that's 650 pages long. And that's another reason for writing short books. Also, people don't like long books anymore. Have you noticed this? They don't.
There must be an exception to the rule.
They don't like long books unless they're very bad.
Explain yourself.
That's to say, the world's crappiest writers can write 700-page novels and they sell a zillion copies. But if good writers write long books, people get bored. Go figure. You tell me. It's your fault.
You set a precedent, at any rate, as far as the book week gift is concerned. I mean, I weighed it on the kitchen scales. It's 247 grams, which is more than twice as much as any number of Dutch authors you'd care to mention. What I wonder also is that, being twice the weight and compressed also in the printing.
It's just 1 gram a page.
1 gram a page, you're quite right, but it might very well take the Dutch public 3 years to recover from a book like this, with all its complexities.
I don't think so. I think people read it in 2 hours and do something else. It's just a book. 250 pages isn't the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's a perfectly ordinary size of book. As I say, for me, it's very, very, very short. So this is my 90-page book. It just happens to be 250 pages long.
To end up with there's a fascinating sort of dichotomy between the living and the dead dolls in the book, shall I say. Mm-hmm. Was this something you'd been intending to do, or is it part of what you describe as the process of writing? You were impinged on by the thought?
Well, one of the things that happens, even in a book that comes out more slowly than this, is that you discover the shape of your idea. As you chisel it out of its raw material, you discover its shape. And so, for me, the discovery that this guy I'd got, who was a kind of retired doll maker, should then meet in New York, not meet, but sort of run up against the story of women who had, in a way, turned themselves into dolls and then got themselves broken. You know, it was a discovery of shape.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's what, in a way, that's what you hope to find. You know, that your imagination has come up with something shapely, and you of course try and discover, you know, some of that shape before you start. In my case, anyway, otherwise you can't start. Or I can't start. But you do hope that as the book reveals itself to you, more and more of those echoes and, you know, assonances, shapelinesses reveal themselves, and that certainly was one.
Dit is ons cadeautje. Het enige waar we dus op letten is of een auteur literatuur schrijft en die weet dat dat een wijd spectrum is, en of we denken dat hij een mooi boekje kan schrijven. Dat is de enige reden waar wij auteurs op selecteren. En ongeacht of het dan een man of een vrouw is, een debutant of een gevestigde binnenland of buitenland.
Tot zover Salman Rushdie. De interviewer, Henk van Woerden, deed dit wat minder, vonden we. En wat dat betreft, de CPMB had wel iemand uit de zaal kunnen halen. Want u zag het, heel veel mensen die het vak van interviewen wel beter verstaan. Maar dit was dus eigenlijk het begin van de boekenweek. Salman Rushdie in de Lutherse kerk. En de bedoeling is dat u zijn boekje krijgt bij aanschaf van een boek in deze boekenweek. Dit was Kleurnet. We hopen dat u dit waardeerde.